Welcome, everyone. We'll get started now. I'm Rebecca Slayton, the director of the Judith Reppy Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies within the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies at Cornell University. This event is also co-sponsored by the Department of Near Eastern Studies. We want to start today's event by acknowledging the grief, the anger, and the fear that many, if not all of us, are experiencing right now. More than 1,400 Israelis have been killed since Hamas launched its surprise attacks on October 7th. Many of them were children. More than 8,500 Palestinians have been killed in the invasion of Gaza, and about 40% of them are children, and those numbers are growing right now. We recognize that the violence that we're seeing didn't start on October 7th. It goes back more than 75 years, at least, to when the United Nations General Assembly decided to divide Palestine into two states. We could look back further to European colonialism. We're not going to try to decide when it began. The problem today is that there's no end in sight, and we want an end to the violence. So today, Cornell's campus, like many campuses around the world, is divided by these decades-old and continuing grievances. And the goal of this conversation is to deepen understanding by creating a space for dialogue between scholarly experts and individuals with a variety of perspectives and experiences. Our conversation today will center humanity and the possibility of future repair. We encourage you to participate in today's conversation in good faith and to work across disagreements as we seek possibilities for peace and restorative justice. Our three panelists all have extensive knowledge of the challenges faced by Israelis and Palestinians today. I'll introduce them in turn as they speak. Each one will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we should have ample time for questions. We encourage you to submit your questions anytime through the Q&A feature of Zoom. We're going to start with Ian Lustig. He is the Beth W. Heyman Chair in the Political Science Department of the University of Pennsylvania. He teaches Middle Eastern politics, comparative politics, and computer modeling. His present research focuses on the disappearance of the option of a negotiated two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and techniques of counterfactual forecasting. With that, I will turn it over to him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm glad that Rebecca opened the way she did because we don't have too much time to make our presentation, and I don't want to have to explain what everyone is feeling, which is terrible about what's going on. So I'm going to start. I'm going to talk a little fast. I've got bullet points, and we can unpack the ones that are most interesting in the Q&A and discussion. Israel has occupied the Gaza Strip twice. It occupied it in 1956 during that war and withdrew about 5 months later. Then it withdrew, or at least took its military and settlers out in the early years of this millennium, but it didn't leave it completely. And what's interesting about this is it's part of a pattern. Whenever Israel has many times crossed its borders militarily into Lebanon, into Sinai in 1948, into Sinai in 1956, into Sinai in 1967, into Jenin not too long ago, and now into Gaza. Whenever it goes into an area and there is not an agreement reached between Israel and the population that lives in that area, the IDF, the Israeli army, always returns. It always returns. This is a pattern that we see, and we've seen it in Gaza. Israel left, but it always returns. In the last 15 years, it has returned into Gaza itself, the army, about 5 times. This is the 5th and much largest incursion or war that has existed between Israel and Hamas, Israel and Islamic Jihad in that period. Now, Israeli attitudes toward the Gaza Strip are kind of contradictory. First of all, let's see, Israelis don't usually call the Gaza Strip anymore. The most common phrase in the Israeli press is at least has been until recently, the coastal enclave, because there's a mixed feeling about whether it's inside of Israel or it's outside of Israel, whether it's inside the state or outside the state. Official maps don't make that clear, and much else doesn't make that clear. On the one hand, Israel, the Gaza area, that coastal enclave, is part of the land of Israel. So from an ideological point of view, especially with the current government, it is part of what should be within the state of Israel, because most of the people in this government favor Jewish sovereignty in all the land of Israel. That would include Gaza. On the other hand, the Gaza Strip contains, as most of you probably know, over 2 million, close to 2.3 million Palestinian Arabs, and no Jews whatsoever. It's one of the most densely packed places in the world, and these aren't any Palestinians. The overwhelming majority of them are descendants of displaced persons who became refugees in 1948, and they are miserable. They have been immiserated for decades. They are furious. They yearn to return to their homes, the lands from which they were expelled or fled, and which they have not are visible from Gaza. Most of them come from the apron, from Jaffa all the way to the northern Negev around Gaza, and that is the deepest motivating feeling among Palestinians is, how can we ever return, and how can we live in these conditions? So Israelis, when they look at Gaza, have mixed feelings. On the one hand, as I said, it's part of the land of Israel, should be in the country, and it's surrounded by Israel. Israel delivers the mail, Israel delivers the water, it collects the taxes, it controls the electromagnetic fields over Gaza, it controls the radio frequencies, it controls how far fishermen can go out, it controls entry and exit, fuel, food, everything. So what is really Gaza to Israel? In two phrases, two prime ministers of Israel kind of put their finger on it. After the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel took control of Gaza for the second time, the Prime Minister Levi Eshkol said, Gaza is a thorn in our throat. And that by that he means we don't know what to do with it. And we can't get rid of it, but it's in our throat. Golda Meir later declared that Gaza was an inseparable part of the state of Israel. Now later, actually another prime minister, Yitzhak Rabin, he said this, which is that he wished that Gaza would just sink into the sea. On the other hand, he said, it's not going to, so we have to do something about it, but what he wanted to do about it was never very clear. Now, if you take the idea that Israel doesn't know whether Gaza is inside the country or outside the country, it makes sense how they actually treated it. What has happened is that Gaza has become essentially of the largest open-air prison in the world, surrounded, as I said, by walls, by wardens, essentially, that control everything that goes in and goes out. And it has a prisoner organization, as all prisons do, including Israeli prisons inside the Green Line, holding Palestinian prisoners. The prisoner organizations control most of what goes on inside the prison, in the cells, in the prison yard, and they have to work with the wardens, and the wardens work with the prisoner organizations. And the Netanyahu administrations, in particular, treated Hamas as their prisoner organization. Now, sometimes prisoner organizations trick the wardens and plan a prison revolt, which is what happened on October 7th. And those prison revolts are usually very, very brutal, and the crushing of a prison revolt is very, very brutal. Of course, what's different is that in the Gaza prison, most of the people who are there have not been convicted or sentenced to anything, but have, in fact, a life sentence. And half of them, of course, are children. So the analogy is not perfect, but what's perfect about it is that it shows how an area that Israel does not know what to do with. Does it want to put it outside of the country or keep it inside? And that's what a prison is. In a way, a prison like Shikma prison or Ashkelon prison or Megiddo prison, those prisons are inside of Israel on the one hand. On the other hand, what goes on in them is a Palestinian space and is not controlled by Israel. So there's both inside and outside of Israel. Now, if we stand back a little and ask, well, why did this happen? Why did this horrible attack take place? And as was mentioned by Rebecca, it all depends when you start the story. If you start the story on the morning of Simchas Torah, then it's a story about barbarians attacking out of the blue, killing innocent people. And the question is, how long will it take for the civilized world to respond, defeat, destroy these barbarians? If you start the story 25 or 75 years ago, it takes on a very different coloration. And really, it's not because the facts are different. It's because which narrative, which context you want to take seriously, and which political point you'd like to make is at stake. But if we look at it, when we hear in Israel a lot of discussion, and we will hear much more, who is to blame? The security services weren't doing their job. They forgot that remote sensors can be destroyed, and then Israeli forces would be blinded. Why were all the battalions that should have been along the Gaza line in the West Bank protecting settlers? Why did that happen? Why was the prime minister not more serious? Why was he so committed to working with Hamas? All of these questions about the tactical mistakes, the strategic mistakes that Israel made, are a distortion of the real cause. They imply that you could have a system as Israel had in place and it could last forever, but it couldn't last forever because what the system was designed to do was to contain and explosively building pressures inside of an arena that could not contain them. If just as a balloon stretches and stretches and stretches as air is pumped into it, it stretches gradually as air is gradually pumped into the balloon, and then pop! It completely non-linearly explodes. That is how systems fail when they're trying to constrain a tremendous amount of building pressure. Ultimately, any system Israel develops to try to contain the pressures inside of Gaza will fail. So ultimately, what can be done about this? How do you look forward? Well, the first thing to say is that there is no solution, but politics doesn't stop. So what now? When I say there is no solution, what do I mean by solution? We all know in our lives, and it's true in politics just as well, that you never really solve a big problem. You just trade the problems you have today for hopefully better ones. Whatever choice you make is not going to be perfect. And that's true in politics. So usually we say, look, the plan I have for this situation will give us better problems than the one we have today. It used to be that there was a two-state negotiated solution. There'd be Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and Israel inside the Green Line, and everything would be minimally satisfactory to these peoples. However, that is no longer possible for many reasons that we don't have time to go into right now. It has been tried, and negotiations have been tried. They have failed every single time. Israel is way beyond, and Palestinians are almost way beyond even being able to entertain it. But on the other hand, what we're faced with now is not even trying to get better problems. What we're faced with right now is trying to avoid very, very much worse problems. We have a catastrophe on our hands right now, but it could become a super catastrophe. If there's a war with Lebanon, if the 100,000 missiles that Hezbollah has at its disposal start flying onto Israeli cities, Israel responds by destroying most of Lebanon. Iran becomes involved. Russians and the United States may become involved. It is a super catastrophe. That's right now what we have to avoid. Also involved in that has to be the scale of the humanitarian catastrophe and the war crimes that both sides are committing and have committed, how much they will expand, how much they will leave a sense that not only is Hamas, Islamic Jihad, outside the pale of civilized political relationships, but depending on the size of the war crimes, the size of the humanitarian catastrophe we see in Gaza, that may affect Israel as well, to become a pariah state in the world. These are problems that could arise from the kind of super catastrophe we need to try to avoid. So what can we do aside from avoiding a super catastrophe? And the day after that we decide, okay, we're not in that realm anymore. We can at least generate pretty pictures. A solution is a pretty picture with a way to get there. A pretty picture, something with better problems than we have today, and a way to get there. Well, we can, right now, it's hard enough just to get a pretty picture of the future. But there are at least two. And one of them, and both of them involve closing the prison. And Israel has to decide, is Gaza inside the country or outside the country? If you close the prison, you make that choice. Either there's a UN trusteeship with the roles for the United States or the EU or the Gulf countries, Egypt, in managing Gaza, in leading it forward, in developing it, in paying for its reconstruction, and Israel may play a role there in a security regime, but a minor role, or Israel decides it's in the country, it erases the borders, and Israelis can live in Gaza, and Palestinians in Gaza can live in what is now Israel. That's the integration leading. That's the other option that Israel has. But if you must close the prison, because if you don't close the prison, this is going to happen again. That's almost a guarantee. Now, aside from thinking about those larger pictures, when we don't have a path to better problems that we can figure out, what I suggest is that people look at their values and they look at the situations and problems that arise every day, and they act on their values in relationship to those. So if you see injustice, if you see suffering, act to alleviate it. Don't think, will this be good or bad for this end state? Because the unintended consequences of the strategies that Israel and Hamas and others are using will very much outweigh and overwhelm all the designs that people have. So if you have a value, as I do, in democracy, in equality, in peace, in respect for non-exclusivist rights to national self-determination, act in the short and medium term to serve those values, and let the unintended consequences play themselves out as everyone does that. I will close by making a prediction. It's not a very happy prediction, but if I had to predict, not certainly, but as the single most probable denouement to this catastrophe, it is that the world will return to trying to achieve a two-state solution. That is the easiest thing for politicians to say in Europe, among the Arab world, even in Israel and in the United States. They will start what I call the peace process carousel that constantly goes around as a merry-go-round and doesn't go anywhere. They will set up a transitional interim arrangement for Gaza that will involve Israeli security responsibilities with outside economic help. And then after 3 or 4 years, when that process grinds to a halt and peters out, as it definitely will, the interim arrangement with Gaza will remain. And people will start arguing about what will become of what is now becoming a more permanent arrangement. Will it trend toward another prison, or will it be an opportunity to build a port in Gaza, an airport, to develop the area, and as a UN trusteeship of some sort? What we see, in other words, here is a kind of secession of attempt by Gaza to secede. It's bloody, it's horrible, it's not going to secede straight away, but Israel's ultimately going to be forced to make a decision it never wanted to make, which is the Gaza Strip inside of Israel, or is it outside of Israel?
Thank you very much, Ian, or Ian. I'm very pleased now to introduce Uriel Avila. He is an associate professor of political science at Tel Aviv University. He studies the politics of fear, happiness, and hope, legitimation, social movements, nationalism, and ethnic conflicts, and has written extensively on the Middle East and Israel. And with that, I will turn it over to Uriel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thanks also to Rachel and everyone who participated in organizing this panel, and everyone who is attending. I know it wasn't an easy decision to make, to organize the panel, and I know it wasn't an easy choice to decide to hold it. I wish I could be as coherent and as eloquent as Ian has been. Ian and I have been conversing for many years now, and we have a lot of debates that I imagine will open now before you. But first, I will have to apologize that I cannot be as coherent. Over the past 3.5 weeks, I mainly felt confused, emotionally, morally, intellectually. I was trying to figure out to myself what I think about the situation, and I can't really say for certain that I've arrived at any conclusive bottom line. But I will share with you my thoughts at the moment. And it starts today when I made that voyage between Jerusalem, where I was born and lived, to Tel Aviv, where I work. It occurred to me that in many ways, the past year for me has been a loss of innocence. A year of losing my innocence, and I'm old enough to not be that innocent, but apparently I have been. An important part of that year has been the ongoing struggle that many Israelis, including myself, have been waging vis-a-vis our own government, vis-a-vis Netanyahu, and his effort to turn a democracy, a limited democracy, a troubled democracy, but a democracy, and in some ways even liberal democracy, into a theocracy, not just a dictatorship, I would say. And it has been a long and strenuous struggle. We still don't know how that will end. And I know that I've been thinking throughout the year about a question that I've only quite recently started to more clearly formulate in my own mind. And it is driven by my approach to Netanyahu. I've been almost half obsessed about the guy. It was very hard for me to fathom him. How can anyone, not just a politician, but anyone, can be so self-centered and so consumed by the pursuit of sheer power for its own sake? I can understand pursuing power for another goal, but power for its own sake, it went beyond me. And recently I understood that what I really was trying to figure out is the problem of evil. Is there really something like that, evil? What does it mean? How do we deal with evil? I don't have all the answers for sure, but I think that on October 7th, I received at least one limited answer in my own personal mind to the first question. There is evil. And Hamas, I would argue, is that. My definition for what evil is humans who are treating other humans as things. As things. Either as obstacle to be removed, or playthings to enjoy at your pleasure, or things to your benefits, but people as things. People as puppets. And this is what Hamas has proven again and again, that it wants to do, that it does. And I imagine that many of you have seen at least some of those horrible video clips that Hamas gunmen have proudly videotaped and distributed, which is truly horrendous. But it goes beyond their approach to Israelis, of course. It is also Hamas' approach to their own people, to the extent that we call Palestinians their own people. Because Hamas treats Palestinians too as things. Things to be used, things to be abused. Whatever the accusation may be leveled against Israel, and I'm full with criticism vis-a-vis Israel, to prevent your own people, so to speak, from going to a safer place down south at gunpoint, to build your headquarters below a hospital, to use human beings as, we call it human shields, but think for a moment about that concept. These are no longer people. These are things, these are shields. To shield who? To shield themselves. I mentioned that it's very important where we start the story. Does it start on October 7th? Before that, maybe 67, maybe 48? I think that one way to approach that question is to ask the Hamas itself. Go to Hamas Covenant. And if you go to Hamas Covenant, you will not find 1967. You would hardly even find 1948. What Hamas has in its covenant, it's quite simply, it's a genocide, very explicitly so. It's a cosmic battle against the Jews, period. Just go Google Hamas Covenant, you will read it. It's out there. As far as I know, there is no prison on earth that has that sort of covenant, and certainly does not, as an ideology, deliberately target civilians. But maybe I'm not aware of all the prisons on earth. Calling the Gaza Strip an open-air prison that Norman Finkelstein coined and started to distribute, it's an interesting concept, prison, again, because you would expect if you are the warden of a prison that you will be able to block entry and exit. However, Gaza does have, of course, borders, substantial one at that, with Egypt. So is it a sort of a co-warden? Potentially so. And now I think I have to leave because there is a siren, which means that I will have to go to a shelter. And I guess some of the prisoners would like to rebel again. Maybe you'll go to the third commentator. I'll try to use my cell phone to join the Zoom. We'll see when I can join you back. Thank you.
Thanks to Uriel. I hope that you'll stay safe. We are going to move on to our third panelist. Lina Dallache is an independent scholar and historian. Her research focuses on the history of Palestine and Israel, with a particular interest in Palestinians who became citizens of Israel in 1948 and how they negotiated their incorporation into the state, affirming their rights as citizens and their identity as Palestinian. She received her PhD in the Joint History and Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies program at NYU. Before coming to NYU, she received a law degree from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Thank you very much for being with us. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much for hosting me and for putting together this event. I wish it was in better circumstances. On October 7th, a group of armed Hamas gunmen broke through the Israeli fence around Gaza and went on to commit a horrible massacre. They killed more than 1,300 Israelis, including innocent women, children, and elderly. They injured thousands, and they still hold over 240 people, Israelis, soldiers and civilians, but also foreign nationals that are being held hostages still. What happened was heartbreaking. It is heartbreaking to watch the tragedy of the families that were devastated, of lives shattered. And this has affected most Israelis on a personal or emotional level. And it affected us, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, some of whom had family members killed or captured, all of whom have been threatened by the state's top leadership since then. And many of us here have family members in Gaza. I live on the same line in so many ways, and I've been experiencing this on that same line in all these ways. For the Palestinians, from the moment the news broke, there has been an ongoing argument about what happened on October 10th, about the legitimacy, about the reasons. And it's a long and torturous discussion in the Palestinian national movement about these methods. Some say that hopeless situations justify all means. Others say that precisely from the position of strategic inferiority that the Palestinians are in, facing the most formidable war machine, Palestinians need to keep the moral high ground. This is not a foreclosed question, and it has been impossible to discern, because since October 7th, Israel has waged a massive attack on the Gaza Strip, guided by sheer revenge. These attacks have been accompanied and justified by a large-scale dehumanization of Palestinians in mass. Not Hamas, but Palestinians, and not only by Israeli officials, but by the leaders of most of the global north. As leaders rushed to offer their military support to one of the strongest military forces in the world, they disregarded the devastation of one of the most densely populated areas in the world and the collective punishment and war crimes against over 2 million people who live in Gaza. This dehumanization is not new. Dehumanizing Palestinians have been a part of the Israeli process of dispossession and control over Palestinians, as it was also a tool in the hands of colonial powers before it. It is what allows the vast majority of Israelis today to support actively or passively the onslaught on civilians in Gaza. with a condemnation for all the brutality against all innocent civilians and any acts that fail to see the humanity in the other. It is important to understand the context in which the events of the 7th and since have taken place, not in order to justify, but if we wish to find a way out, we need to know how we go together and how we get there. And the war in Gaza is only another phase of an ongoing colonial violence rooted in the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967, and in the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe that started in 1948. And specifically in Gaza, as I mentioned, Gaza is predominantly a refugee society. It is about a home of about 1.7 million refugees who have been displaced in 1948, many of whom live merely miles from their families' homes in towns that Israel destroyed in the aftermath of the Nakba. They have and continue to demand the right to return. Things have been made much worse with the Israeli quote-unquote disengagement in 2005 that I mentioned, but also the closure or the siege or the prison, whichever term you choose to use, since 2007. In the 16 years since then, not only has Israel imprisoned the Palestinians, depriving them basic means for existence, but it has also launched the attacks against the besieged area, including large-scale attacks in 2008, 2012, and 2014, each having a different name of an operation, with thousands killed and extensive damage to homes and infrastructure, some of which has never actually been recovered. The cumulative result of the Israeli policies is the desperate situation in Gaza. According to UN OCHA, before this round of hostilities began, 81% of the population in Gaza lived in poverty. 63% of citizens of Gaza suffered from food insecurity. The unemployment rate was 44%, and access to clean water and electricity was extremely limited, as was access to healthcare. The result also was high rates of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder among young people in Gaza. And as Maya mentioned, Gaza is predominantly, or in a very significant percentage, a young population. Now, despite the bad starting point, Israel has immensely escalated the conditions in Gaza. Large-scale indiscriminate destruction is accompanied by the total blockage, preventing access to water, fuel, electricity, food, and medicine, or medical need. Humanitarian agencies are warning that Gaza is on the brink. Thousands killed, tens of thousands injured. 40%, as mentioned, 40% of those who have been killed are children. Many more are missing and presumed to have been buried under the rubble. It is estimated about 45% of the total housing units in Gaza have been destroyed or damaged, and about 1.4 million people have been internally displaced. The situation is so dire in Gaza that many people from Gaza are now posting on social media things like, quote, "Our biggest dreams are to find bread and a drink of water." And the people of Gaza want to live. A Palestinian, Khalil, wrote a few days ago, "I have many dreams, ambitions, and goals. I know how to love, I know how to be happy, and I know how to work and achieve. I am not a number. I am not a number. I am a complete planet." Khalil had started a Facebook page a few years ago, which translates to "We Who Are Behind the Walls," which seeks to connect Israelis with Palestinians in Gaza to promote peace. And he has been in regular contact with his Israeli friends, even during these horrifying dark times. Today, Khalil was injured. But as Palestinians face unimaginable catastrophic assault, they also face the specter of another displacement. Not only Israel has ordered over 1.1 million Palestinian residents to leave their homes, but Israeli politicians and strategists and strategic analysts are calling for wiping out Gaza. One professor at Tel Aviv University even called for creating a park on the wiped out Gaza city and the northern part of the Gaza Strip this week. One of the people on this panel, on this webinar, just asked, why can't the Palestinians be moved to the Sinai? This is how acceptable this has become. This is how common this inability to see the Palestinians and their humanity, and to treat them as things. And while all the eyes are on Gaza, settlers in the West Bank are seizing every opportunity, protected if not actively aided by the IDF, to advance dispossession and displacement of those Palestinians in the West Bank. Dozens of communities are under threat. Many have already been forced to leave, and many are scared and awaiting this fate unless something changed. And the world that rightfully condemned October 7th assault on Israeli civilians, it watches on as the war crimes continue to take place. And as I find it hard to find hope in the question, and to answer the question of the future, I will quote my friend and mentor Gadi El-Ghazi, who posted about a week after October 7th. So what for now? Yes, to try to maintain our humanity for the sake of all of us. But this is not only a moral question, it is a political question. Barbarization is produced by dispossession, slavery and deprivation, exploitation, humiliation, and abuse. But I know of no other basic answer to do everything in our power to put an end to them and to strive for a political settlement so that all of us, Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs, can truly live as human beings in human form, in freedom and equality. We as Palestinian citizens, this is me again, we as Palestinian citizens understand the present moment in ways that others can't. As we are part of Palestine and Israel, because of our positionality and our history, we can see clearly that there has to be a way out of this impasse that addresses Palestinians' demands while understanding Israeli existential fears. But for now, for us to keep the possibility for peace, to keep our humanity, we must demand an immediate ceasefire and allow for the necessary humanitarian aid to enter Gaza to stop the mounting death toll of innocents, which is already far beyond what Palestinians and Israelis have faced for decades. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lena. I want to give a little bit of time to the panelists to respond to each other. Also, Uriel, I know you may not have been able to quite finish your remarks earlier. So I'd like to give you the opportunity to do that, Uriel. I also would like Ian, you mentioned near the end of your presentation, you spoke of this as Israel's choice as what they will do next. And I think one of the things that Lena has helpfully done is to broaden the perspective on, and to remind us of the broader perspective of the different actors, the world stage, the global north, that have enabled and empowered the current situation and the current violence to occur. So I'm wondering if you could respond a little bit to each other on that point. What is the responsibility of the international community more broadly at this moment, in the past? And then, Uriel, if you have anything else that you would also like to add either on that point or that you didn't get to say earlier, I want to make sure you have the chance to do that as well.
Would you like me to go first?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Well, I would like to respond to a couple of things that Uriel said. Martin Buber said there's a big difference between an I-thou relationship and an I-it relationship. I-it is when you use things, including people, and it's an inevitable part of human life. We have to manipulate the world in order to live. You can't be in an I-thou relationship with everything all the time. So the evil is not using people. Evil is using people in a completely disproportionate way. So you pay no attention to their value in your ruthless ambition to do whatever you want with them or to them. In that context, that is why international law does not forbid the killing of civilians in the process of collateral damage. What it forbids is the disproportionate killing of civilians, or the disproportionate infliction. In other words, it's a judgment call, but if you have a question of how many civilians are you going to kill in order to kill one operative of your opponent. It's also the case that it's not just Hamas that uses human shields. Every resistance movement does it. The Haganah put its arms building factories in daycare centers, in synagogues, on kibbutzim, knowing or believing, hoping that the British would not find them or destroy them because of that. It's a typical thing that all movements do, especially those who are located in crowded and urban areas. So that itself, the fact that people use others is not itself evil. What's evil is the vast disproportionate exploitation of others for that purpose. There is, I take issue about Hamas. Hamas's original covenant was all filled with Quranic verses against the Jews, and it's colloquial in Palestinian talk to talk about the Jews and not the Israelis. But in the 2017 covenant, because the old covenant was thrown out, there are whole paragraphs saying this: we are not opposed to the Jews, we are not anti-Semitic, we're opposed to the Zionist project. And it does, in fact, start with 1947. That is explicitly in the covenant. So if you do want to Google the covenant, as Uriel suggests, I encourage you to do it and note the differences between 2017 and 1988. Finally, on the question that Rebecca has posed about the international community, there's an interesting situation, and it's true in Ukraine as well, although we might not want to talk about that today, that Israel has been unable to end any of its wars from 1948 on until a great power tells it it must end. Because the problem that Zionism has in the Middle East, and I'm sympathetic with it, is how can you have a Jewish country in an Arab Middle East that doesn't want you there? That's a political problem, and it can't be solved militarily. So every time Israel fights a war, 56, 48, 67, 69 to 70, 73, 82, 2006, and now this one, it tells the people that the army will this time be allowed to finish the job. This time, the army will actually finish the job. And then, of course, the army cannot finish the job because it's a political job. And so the government has to have a reason for stopping. We would have finished the job, but Britain told us to stop. We would have finished the job, but the United States said to stop. When the United States, which is the key superpower now, turns on the red light, that's when this war will stop, and it won't stop until that happens. When Biden went to the Middle East, to Israel, he turned off the green light and turned on the yellow light. That's typical of these wars. What has to happen is the United States has to turn on the red light, and only then will this stop. That's how every single war has ended. And if you want, we could go back to every one, whether it's 67 or 73 or 6 or 70, and see how the fighting stopped only when a superpower told Israel, okay, now it's over.
Thank you, Ian. Uriel, would you like to respond, finish anything that you had to say earlier? And then I also want to give Dina a chance to respond.
Yeah, maybe a combination of the two. Yeah, I was thinking that the 2017 document would be raised. It's interesting because if you actually look at the details, and they are very clear, it wasn't to replace any covenant, and they explicitly did not call it a covenant. Unlike what happened with the PLO, with the Oslo negotiations, there was no change of the covenant. Musa Marzouk said so very explicitly. This is a general document. That was the title of the document. It doesn't replace anything of the covenant. We're still obliged by it. He said so in his own voice. You can look it up. But beyond the covenant itself, beyond the words, there are the actions. It can, for the life of me, I can't really understand how anyone can interpret October 7th by any other way other than deliberately targeting civilians. By the way, not just Israelis and Jews, whomever they can lay their hands on. And again, the same sort of approach that the Hamas has towards Israelis and Jews worldwide is the approach that they have, to some extent at least, vis-a-vis the Palestinians. That's their takeaway. My full definition of meaning in that regard is not just treating people as things, but doing it consciously and consistently. And they have been doing that. Now, to a certain extent, I would say the same about the Israeli government. And I would go a step further in terms of outlining what I think can be done. I think the way to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is to transform it. I think the biggest mistake that we are making is calling it the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as if all Israelis and all Palestinians are some sort of monolithic entities that are destined to fight each other. If anything should have been learned over the past year for Israelis, from an Israeli perspective, is that we are not as one. And the same goes for the Palestinians. The same goes for the Palestinians. If you look at public opinion polls conducted just before that atrocity of October 7th, the majority of Palestinians do not support the Hamas. Moreover, the overwhelming majority of Palestinians do not support what Hamas has done. Now, true enough, those sort of escalations have their way of radicalizing the people. And this is what we have seen in the conflict again and again and again. We are all, in one way or another, hijacked by those radicals. And so instead of speaking relentlessly about these two monolithic of Israelis and Palestinians, and each and every one of us can portray the other as evil, I think that's nonsense. Not all the Palestinians are evil. Not certainly all Israelis are evil. The overwhelming majority of both people would be able to live in peace if we both together wage our war against the ultra-nationalists and the ultra-religious. And we have quite a bit of both on both sides. You know what? I'll conclude with a short personal anecdote from my own current life, if I would be allowed, Rebecca, for just 2 minutes. My mother very much belonged to that radical right wing. Very much belonged. In all those many Saturdays, and not just Saturdays, that I went to demonstrate against Netanyahu, she was looking at me and telling me, "What are you doing? You're destroying the country. Netanyahu is trying to protect us." And she thinks the Arabs can only understand the language of force. And yes, there are such utterances in Israel. Last night, my mother woke up from bed and she fell. And she broke her thigh and she was rushed to the ER. And I spent many hours with her. What brought tears to her eyes is telling me about how wonderfully well the staff at the hospital treated her. The physician and the nurses, people who was running the administrative, the logistics. And you know what she kept on telling me? Almost all of them were Arabs. And that's in Jerusalem, you know, this torn out city. Coexistence is not just possible in the future. It already exists now in the present for the majority of people. But we do have radicals, like we have Hamas among the Palestinians. We have someone like Ben Gvir or Smotrich among Israelis. So I would advise all of us, including you, in that regard. And Nina, and I'm sorry that I didn't hear all your comments. We should be able to unite together against those radical forces. Towards what solution? Yes, I'm still with the two-state solution. If you look at public opinion polls, it's not a mirage. On both peoples, even today, most of them support that. Maybe one day there will be a possibility for one Israel and Palestine, whatever that will be called. Let it be. I'm with Lennon. Imagine all of that. I don't think this is realistic for the interim stage. Once each people, each nation will have its safe space, I wish we can come together. Maybe it will be a confederation, maybe it will be a single state. I have no idea. But we should give each people their own safety and security. And this is possible. And this is possible. It requires what I think Biden should have done from the first day. You know, we tried to conclude the First World War with the 14 points of Wilson. I would say half would be enough for Biden. 7 points that delineate a future. The way to fight this war against the radicals, I would argue, is to come together and to help people, both Palestinians and Israelis, hope for peace. And it is possible if we now delineate what sort of future that might look like. And yes, I think that for now, at least, a two-state solution is the most realistic one. And if the US come together with the EU, with key regional actors, most notably, of course, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and there should be some special treatment for Qatar in that regard, that has been funding supposedly Gaza, but effectively the Hamas, again and again. All of that should be part of this matrix. And this is a way not to conclude a world war, but to prevent one, because it is explosive. The whole place is detonated. If it comes to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, very close to where I live, this is how it all can go and explode. And this is what we should try and avoid as much as possible right now. And I don't think that we try enough. And I think that in this blame game, we are not going to get anywhere. And fighting Hamas should be a joint call for both Palestinians and Israelis. Fighting Netanyahu's government should be a joint call for both Palestinians and Israelis. Differently done, right? One should involve also a military aspect. One is primarily political. But there are ways to achieve that. People, and I'm telling you, you have to be either Palestinian or Israeli to see that. And it's not just the hospital. In my own neighborhood in Jerusalem, the French Hill, people live together, Jews and Arabs. After the first 2 weeks, my wife organized a sort of a small forum of Palestinians and Jewish women. Mainly, I was the only man in the forum. And they were speaking to each other from the heart about their pain. And by the end of that conversation, I'll conclude with that. By the end of that conversation, you know, the most saddening thing that I've heard was each and every one of them, both Jews and Palestinians, saying, well, this is how the way the world is. The world is an evil place. It's going to hell. We might as well just live. And I'm saying, no, this is not the way the world is. There is evil, but it's small. We are the 99%, but we should recognize that. Instead of blaming everyone among the Palestinians or everyone among the Israelis, try to understand it's more complicated than that. And this is a fight against the radicals that we can all win together. Or we can stand apart and lose.
Thank you, Uriel. I want to give Lena a chance to respond to what's been said as well. And then we do have a number of good questions that we're collecting. Ayan, I know you also, I could see that you had some points of disagreement with what Uriel has said. I'd ask you to just save that for, you'll have a chance to talk more. But Lena, I want to give you a chance to respond so that each of you has had a chance to respond to what others have said.
Thank you. I fully agree with Ayan about the international intervention aspect, and one of my things about in living in the US and teaching in the US for a long time has been the mantra that you pay for it, you take responsibility for it. The US is paying for the crimes that are taking place in Gaza now. And I don't think anyone has any questions about the fact that it is war crimes. And to me, that makes it a personal responsibility of every American to actually stand up and say, this cannot be in our name. But I'm not naive to not understand the power structures. And I agree with Ayan that eventually a superpower, in this case, the US, has to pull the plug and say, that's it. You no longer have the license to do this. But I will also highlight that the flip side means that right now, the US is allowing this to happen. This is happening with the US blessing and support. Maybe yellow light, but it's still a very much a light that says, go on and do what you want to do. And we are behind you, and we're also sending you weapons and everything you need in the process, just to make sure. But that being said, I want to turn to what Ariel has been talking about. And peace and love are great, and living together is great, but that's not the conversation. What we were talking about is structural forces and structures of injustice. And those are not going to be resolved by the Palestinian doctors in the hospitals or by the construction workers who basically built Israel from 48 or even before until today. It is going to be resolved by undoing the power structure that has been created in 48, that has created injustice that continues until today. Israel has been, from the first moment, a state that has defined itself as a Jewish state when it had a very significant Palestinian minority. This is my research. I show how Israeli citizenship was shaped by the conflicts and by the struggles of the Palestinian citizens who insisted on keeping their place in their country, despite very, very harsh reality, harsh treatment, and military government. But even more than that, Israel has forced 750,000 Palestinians to become refugees in 48, and it has refused, despite repeated international decisions, to allow any of them back into their homes. Israel continues to forcefully occupy the Palestinian territories. In the West Bank, the settlements have expanded in exponential strides over the past decade. And settlements are not only the people who live there, it's violence. It's daily, relentless violence against the Palestinians. It's land grab, it's restrictions on every movement, it's theft of resources at the expense of the Palestinians. So if you look, for instance, at UN statistics about water consumption, you can see that the Israeli settlers use far above the international rate, and the Palestinians are not even able to reach the minimum required for human living. This is a structure that, unless we challenge it, unless we decide, we force Israel, and I do not believe that anything is going to be resolved from inside here. I do believe that it's going to have to be outside pressure, unless we force Israel to forsake being a settler colonial state. This is not going to end. This is not a personal issue. I agree with you, Ariel. It's not that the Palestinians or the Israelis as such are evil, but the system of the Israeli occupation and control over the Palestinians is unjust, and it must go. And the only way out of this is if it goes.
Thank you very much, Nina. I want to, we'll all continue to talk and respond. I know you have a lot to say, and you have a lot of expertise. I want to give the audience some chance to raise some questions that you can respond to as well. The first one comes from Mustafa Minawi, a professor in Near Eastern Studies here at Cornell. He asks, can you comment on what is happening in the West Bank and how does it relate to the war on Gaza, and how?
I'd be happy to comment on that. When the war broke out on October 7th, there were 5,200 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons, 5,200, not counting Gaza. There are now, just 3 weeks later, well over 10,000. In other words, Israel has doubled the prisoner population, mainly by arresting West Bank Palestinians, but also Arab citizens of Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, which has gone largely unnoticed. And this is mainly people who have had any association in the Israeli files with anybody in Hamas or any other resistance or militant organization that is not officially approved by Israel. And that they just announced today that everyone arrested on that charge will have a minimum 1-year prison sentence. So not for doing anything, just for being in some way associated or sympathizing with apparently this. So that's one thing that's happening. People have to know why those people are called prisoners when they're abducted at night by military from their homes, dragged out and put in prison without a trial, instead of abductees or hostages, is not clear, because that's what they are. Israel is using them as a bargaining chip, looking at the negotiations with Hamas about how many Israeli hostages will be traded for how many Palestinian hostages. It's when I see pictures of Israeli hostages up, my heart breaks. But I don't understand why I'm not seeing pictures of Palestinian hostages up, because there are thousands of them in administrative detention, that is to say, with no criminal charge against them, no trial, and in being held. So that is one thing to talk about the West Bank. The other thing is that there's been about, I think now, over 100 Palestinian Arabs have been killed since the beginning of the war by settlers and the army. Now, there was a pretty high rate of killing even before the war, a few a week, 4 or 5 a week. But this is this is 100 in 2.5 to 3 weeks. This is a kind of lynching that's going on there, fury by the part of settlers who are looking to unleash their anger. And I can understand why they're angry, but the failure of the army to do what it's supposed to do in an occupied area, which is to protect the civilian population, is itself a crime. Now, what this is doing is also producing in the West Bank, even in the face of Hamas atrocities, a huge upsurge in support for Hamas. So if you had elections in the West Bank now, even with what has happened, and not because the Palestinians endorsed that method, Hamas would win. Just as Hamas was the only organization ever to win a free election in Gaza. They won the election in 2006. There was a coup attempt against them by the United States, Israel, and the Palestinian Authority. The Hamas defeated that coup, and then Hamas changed. It took a path. The military wing has clearly taken over and has become a fanatical terrorist organization that is beyond, in my view, the pale of civilized discourse. Though it's crucial to look at the hostage situation and deal with whoever you have to deal with, devil or no, to get those hostages released. And when I say hostages, I don't only refer to Israeli hostages.
May I respond too?
Yes, please.
So Ian, just to correct the numbers that you provided, since the beginning of the war, there is a rise of 2,100,000. 2,100. These are the formal numbers that we have at the moment. We can exchange links later, but these are formal numbers at this moment, right? So this is one correction. The other correction, that the number of people killed in the West Bank is 52, as far as I know. This is the updated information that I have. But it is horrendous. I mean, other than that, I would concur with Ian. This is horrendous. The settlers have been doing whatever they want, basically, in the West Bank. They get the backing of the government. To a certain extent, they get the backing of the IDF. And it's simply horrendous. Nothing of what I said before was in any way, shape, or form to excuse Israeli occupation. But I think it's important that we stick to the facts. Another fact that is important to note in that regard, I don't think at all that Hamas' victory in a potential election is assured, by far. Again, if you look, for example, at public opinion poll, putting a Hamas leadership on the one hand and Abu Mazen, right, the current leader of the Palestinian Authority, on the other, Hamas wins, most definitely. People say that they would hardly go for the ballot, but Hamas will win with those who actually go to the ballot. But if, for example, apropos the prisoners, that you emphasize so much, if Marwan Barghouti is released, he's a popular leader of the PLO, and he was in prison because he was convicted of murder. But if Marwan Barghouti, who is potentially a more moderate leader to negotiate with, if Marwan Barghouti is running, and this is, again, a poll just from a couple of months ago, 3 months ago, I think, he's winning in a landslide against Hamas with a very substantial turnout. So again, we should bear all of those facts in mind. And, bashing Israel is a nice practice, and I do it occasionally too. It's perfectly fine. But we have to keep in mind that if we truly want to resolve this crisis, it has to be done by moderate Israelis, moderate Palestinians coming together. Vilifying the entire other nation, people, whatever we might call it, is the worst way possible to go about it. I would just to Lina's argument about what is to be done and the pressure from the outside, the power structure and all of that, I get it completely. And I understand that this is partly of what the BDS movement have been trying to do, although I think the actual call is for the annihilation of Israel. Even without a genocide, it actually targets a politicide, the demolishment of the Jewish state. And I would completely understand that position if the argument is that it is bad to have a state based on an ethno-national creed. As a sort of a principle moral argument, no state in the world should be based on an ethno-national creed. I get that. And Israel is certainly a state that is based on an ethno-national creed. There is no way around it. But that's basically what one is called when one is calling for a Palestinian state. And this is about 60 to 70% of states worldwide. Why starting specifically with the Jewish state to advance this vision, I think is questionable. And I think it is something to contemplate. Now, I'm with you.
Because 20%?
Can I just complete? I'm with you in terms of the long-term vision. I would like to see all of that gone. But I'm not sure that the state for that particular nation, that particular people that has been persecuted for millennia, and we see the implication in these days as well, in many manifestations of anti-Semitism worldwide, I'm not sure this is the best place to start and deconstruct the nation state. Maybe there is a possibility to go through an interim phase in which there is a nation state for the Jewish people with complete liberal democratic values and practices for both Jews and Arabs, and the same with Palestine. And then perhaps we can transcend those boundaries, which I very much would like to see.
Okay, Lina, please.
Sorry, I'm going to very briefly just say what I interjected. I'm sorry for the interjection, but you repeated the point, and I just want to say I am a citizen of Israel. There's 20% of Israeli citizens who are not Jewish. So the fact that Israel wants to define itself as a Jewish state is erasing me and my ancestors who are a part of this country by definition. So this is why it becomes a personal thing, and I had to interject, but I do apologize for that. I do want to focus on the question, which is what's going on in the West Bank. Ian presented a very good picture, but I want to highlight another aspect, and I want to also bring our attention to one thing. It is not the settlers alone. It is settlers that now have become completely in control of the state structures in the West Bank that are completely embedded in the army and its institutions. If you look at the videos of what's happening in the West Bank, you see soldiers standing right there, guarding the people who are attacking the Palestinians, the settlers. So this is not only an individual thing. This is not a group of crazy messianic fanatics. They're actually represented in the highest levels of power in the state of Israel. Bezalel Smotrich is the Minister of Finance, but he's also the Minister of something that basically controls the West Bank. Itamar Ben-Gvir is the Minister of National Insecurity. I refuse to call him National Security. And they have massive influence, and they are actually fueling and supporting the onslaught on the Palestinians. And part of it is anger. But you know what? It's been 3 weeks. It's not anger. It is using the moment to systematically implement what they've actually been planning and calling for years. If you go to the websites of the settler movement, you will see that what is happening now is basically what they've been planning. They're just using this as an appropriate hour. As I mentioned, several communities have been displaced over the past few months, not since October 10th, but since the beginning of the year. Several communities have been forced out and displaced in what basically can only be understood as ethnic cleansing that the state is complicit in. And several others are under the threat. Right now, Israeli and Palestinian and international activists are staying in South Hebron Hills, in Susia, and other communities because these communities had settlers come in the middle of the night and tell them that if they did not get out of there immediately, they will be killed. This is imminent. This is happening right now. And this is also financed by the US. I want to say that because I think that what we need right now is a very clear voice from the US that says, not in our name, not on our watch. We will not allow ethnic cleansing of Palestinian civilians who are merely trying to live on lands they've lived on for a really long time. We need to be very clear here. This is not, what is the Israeli term is asavim sotim. This is not some wild thorns that are like radical margin. This is a state project in the making, and we have to stop it because 1948 never ended. And right now, we're just watching another iteration of it that is going to cost very, very significant damage to people's lives, but also to our future.
I would just say I completely agree with Lena, and I think that what Ben Gvir has in mind is to foster a civil war in Israel. I think it's very clear. He's arming people, not just in the territories, in Israel too. Part of the implications of October 7, he's arming people and he's trying to highlight as much as possible the inner armed threat in Israel itself in order to create some sort of escalation where he will emerge as a hero saving Israel by arms. This is a plan for civil war, and we shouldn't play to their hands.
Thank you. I think Ian has a comment.
I have a question for Uriel, which maybe help us move toward some kind of more positive thinking about the future, because he brought up the difficulty of focusing on Israel as the place that has to stop being an ethnocratic state before everybody else does. Uriel mentioned that he lives in side by side in French Hill with Palestinians, and that they now French Hill, as the audience may know, is about the first Israeli settlement over the Green Line that was built in 1967. So Uriel is one of the 11% of Israeli Jews who live over the Green Line in the West Bank, essentially. And that's one of the reasons I say when you have 11% of the Jewish population living in this area, it is a part of the country. It is inside the country just as much as the Central Galilee, which has fewer Jews in it than the West Bank. So my question is this: those Palestinians that you are living alongside of are not citizens of the country. For 75 years, they've been unable to vote in parliamentary elections because they're not Israeli citizens. Now,
yeah, you're wrong about that.
No, excuse me, the Palestinians who live in that area.
No, but in the neighborhood itself, there are citizens. Those
I'm sure there are some Arab citizens who have moved there, but the native population, where those people who lived there before French Hill was built, the people who live in that area in East Jerusalem are not Israeli citizens. I'm asking Uriel whether he thinks that those people who live in his city, in Al-Quds, in Jerusalem, should be equal to him as citizens in the country that determines their fate, or should they not be equal citizens?
Of course they should. you know my position on that.
Well, but that means that they would. So that would mean it's not the capital of that's not East Jerusalem would not be the capital of the Palestinian state. Then, right? Israel would keep.
No,
I'm asking about whether East Jerusalem and its Arabs would be part of the the Palestinian state, or whether they would be given citizenship in Israel. And I'm asking whether you want your neighbors to be citizens of the country you are a citizen of.
I want everyone between the river and the sea to be citizens of either Israel or Palestine, and equal citizens at that.
But if there is no Palestine now, in the meantime,
but you know that I think that there should be Palestine.
Yes, but what I'm saying is there's a silent apartheid that takes 75 years and could go on for another 50 years if you wait for something that will never come, which is, as I said in my prediction, there will be a restarting of the two-state solution merry-go-round, but it will fail. And you will be back 4 years, and I'll still ask you the question, do you think your neighbors should be citizens? And you say, well, when we someday make a second state, then they can be citizens. But for the time being, no, I don't want them to try to become citizens because they should be part of the two-state solution. And that's a convenient way to keep Arabs out of the political system.
No, I think that we know each other well enough for you to know that my goal is not to wait for another 50 years for anything better to happen.
Good.
Struggle that I'm making, both as a scholar and as an activist, is to try and make it as soon as possible. This is what we have been struggling for decades now, and this is what we've certainly been struggling for over the past year. Now it is an uphill battle, but we need people who join us. We need partners for this battle. And in order to have partners, we need some sort of realization that not all Israelis and not Israel per se is a demon to be persecuted. Neither are the Palestinians or the Palestinian Authority. Hamas, I think, in this regard, is very much like, in those specific aspects, like Ben Gvir or Smotrich. And we should fight them together. Again and again, I'm repeating that point. Because I think that the approach of trying to create a sort of a complete dichotomy between the two, and whatever party you take, it doesn't matter. It's the dichotomy itself that undermines peace effort again and again, and it almost doesn't really matter what solution you're up for. Whether it's the two states or the one-state solution, nothing will happen, nothing good will happen. As long as we trap ourselves in this sort of dichotomous thinking, monolithic, static thinking. This is not the case, Ayn. I'm telling you, as someone who is living in Israel, most Israelis, overwhelmingly, most Palestinians, overwhelmingly, are capable of reaching accommodation. It is radical leadership, militant leadership, that is again and again has been taken as hostages. We should free ourselves of that, and the way to do it is not to blame the other nation or the other state or the other polity in the case of the Palestinian Authority or Hamas. That's not the way to do it.
I would like to make sure, thank you both for this very respectful and constructive engagement. I would like to make sure that we get to a few more audience questions. We have a very good question from Professor Matt Evangelista, which I have just lost in my, maybe, Ian, did you already answer that? Is that why?
I gave one line answer, but.
Okay, a one-line answer. Let's have a little more discussion of it, because I think it's an excellent question. Does describing Israel as a, quote, settler colonial society imply any solution? One can imagine comparative cases such as Algeria or South Africa that played out differently from each other. And I asked this also because there are other people in the Q&A who are raising the issue of colonialism and the European history of colonialism in the region. So if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I've written a couple books about this question. Settler colonialism is probably the single most popular paradigm to use now to look at the general problem of Israel and Palestine, but it doesn't imply a particular outcome because there have been so many settler colonial societies, and one of them is Algeria. There you have, for example, the settlers just thrown out, and you have a military government, a revolution. The FLN gets thrown out by a military dictatorship, and it's still there all these years later. South Africa, you get a transformation into a democratic society, a multiracial democratic society from an ethnocratic state. But in Ireland, you have, which was also a settler colonial society, you got the absorption of Ireland into Britain, and then the secession 120 years later of 3/4 of it, which is kind of the one-state solution, is the first step to the two-state solution. And then in the United States, which was a settler colonial society based as a country for white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men. And it took a long time. It took a civil war, but it became a multiracial democracy, flawed, but includes women and blacks and Native Americans who were completely excluded. So that shows that just because you start as a settler colonial society, really there's a lot of options for where things can go. And I think it is useful to systematically compare those pasts of those settler colonial societies in order to imagine futures that are different and interesting for Israel and Palestine.
I would briefly, hopefully briefly, interject and say that, yes, I think the comparison is useful. I myself also wrote a book comparing Zionists to Afrikaners and the French Canadians. I think it is useful to make that comparison. However, I think the analogy, the very popular analogy, and of course I have a long disagreement on that, the analogy between Israel or Zionism and apartheid and colonialism, I think it is factually false. I think it's intellectually lazy. I think it's morally wrong. And I think that it's practically counterproductive. Anyone who knows the history of apartheid, anyone who knows the history of South Africa, know, for example, that at the heart of it was the struggle of the ANC, the African National Congress. And what was the ANC clear plea throughout the years, throughout the decades? To regard South Africa as one for everyone, not seeing the white of South Africa, whether Afrikaners or the Anglophone, as colonially settlers. Look at the ANC. and compare that to the PLO and certainly to Hamas covenant. It's exactly the opposite of what they have been proposing. The word itself, apartheid, comes from Afrikaans. Apartheid means separateness. They were struggling against separateness. Now, from the moment that the PLO embraced the two-state solution, separateness is what it's all about, basically endorsing separateness. That's about apartheid. And by the way, it's interesting, if you look at the chronicles of apartheid, there is nothing even remotely close in the history of the whole struggle against apartheid to the atrocities committed by Hamas, and not just on October 7th. And if you compare Zionism to colonialism, again, I think it falls apart. If you compare the trajectory, say, for example, with FLN and Algeria, to what has been going on in the case of Israel, if you look at the way that the FLN conducted itself vis-a-vis Algeria, but the way that the France conducted itself vis-a-vis the FLN, again and again, the comparison falls apart. There is, to a certain extent, analogy when it comes to the Israeli treatment of the territories. There are elements of colonialism going on there. But to treat Israel itself as a colonial endeavor, of which empire exactly? Of the Ottoman Empire, of the British Empire that the Zionists have fought? These sort of analogies, which I understand, it's interesting, intellectually speaking, to make this sort of comparison, it's enriching. But then you trap yourself in those conceptualizations, and you turn them into a sort of a sacred hub from which you derive your conclusions. It makes no sense to me. And again, I think that intellectually, it's a lazy work and it doesn't advance the cause of peace. Quite the opposite. Because it takes a complicated situation, it tries to simplify it with a sort of a moral tag that falls apart once you look at the details of them. It simply falls apart.
Nina, do you? Yeah.
Yes, please. I raised the issue of settler colonialism, and I would like to explain. Settler colonialism is not an answer to all the questions about Israel-Palestine. It is also not the cut-paste scenario. It is something that is complicated. Why is settler colonialism useful? Is because it can give us some ideas about structures, structures of power, structures of state, and structures of resistance to settler colonial states. But in simple definition to explain why I think Israel is settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is basically premised on the idea of people coming from outside to take permanent residence in an area, in a new area, in a colony, with the intention of making a sovereignty in it, and that they use the resources of this area for the exclusive benefit of the settler population. If we take it this way, this is a definition that is definitely what is happening in this situation. There are variations. It is not the same exact thing as in Ireland. And I've had people, I teach a class that is some comparative settler colonialism, Israel, Palestine, South Africa, and Ireland. And I've had people argue with me that Ireland is not a settler colonial case. And I've had people who, when I taught it with Algeria, had arguments about that. But the point is not one-to-one. But if we speak in the US about decolonization, we speak about dismantling the structures of power that have marginalized the indigenous population and push them basically off their resources for the exclusive benefit of the white colonial population. If we talk about decolonization, one of the first premises is to undo the historical justice. And I think in this particular case, we're talking about the same thing. And the exclusive use of the resources, land, water, all the resources in Palestine, land, of course, being a very crucial aspect here, especially because of the right of return that has made it available for the Jewish population while depriving the Palestinian population. But also, I believe that without recognizing the historical injustice, which again includes the right of return, we are unable to move forward in this in any process of reconciliation.
Thank you. So we're close to the end of our time, but we still have a few minutes. I'd like to give, and I apologize to the many people who posed questions. I know not everyone can see the questions. I don't believe actually any of the audience can see the questions. I think it's mostly just something panelists and hosts can see. I apologize that we have not been able to get through them all. There are many good comments. I do hope that we will continue this conversation. And of course, you all who have questions are welcome to email speakers directly, reach out to other experts in the field to get your questions answered. I do want to give.
I want to emphasize that people may be disturbed or upset or interested in things I had to say. Please feel free to email me, and I will respond.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'd like each of you to maybe take just 1 minute. I know it's extremely hard to be brief. We've covered a lot of territory and not covered a lot more that you could say. But maybe just 1 minute of concluding comments, and then we'll wrap it up. Ayan, I'll let you go first. We'll just go in the order that we started with.
One comment. 126,000 Israelis have been displaced from their homes in the northern strip along the Lebanon border and in the apron around Gaza. 126,000 displaced persons. They are not refugees. They will become refugees if they are prevented from returning to their homes. The same thing happened to Palestinians in 1948. The refugees in Gaza are not refugees because they fled or were driven out. They're refugees because in a war, people get displaced. Refugees are created when they're not allowed to return. And Israel's decision to forcibly prevent the return of displaced persons to their homes is what gave us this problem now. Of course, I certainly hope that all Israelis will be able to return to their homes and stop being displaced persons and not become refugees.
Thank you. Uriel?
Maybe I'll say just a couple of words about what we're doing now and what I hope we'll be able to continue to do. For me, academia is a sort of a love affair. I remember the first time that I stepped into the ivory tower back in Israel at the Hebrew University. And it's heartbreaking sometimes to see what occasionally happens in academia and in the name of academic discourse. I think that we should try our best to use our intellectual tools in order to understand and help people, rather than using people in order to advance, whether it is some sort of aggrandized attempt of positioning ourselves as knowing it all. Because again and again, I fear the possibility that our academic insight will be used partly by us, by faculty, as goals for which we use the people on the ground, the people who are suffering. And what I wish all of us to be able to do more and more is to take into consideration the unbelievable suffering that both Israelis and Palestinians are undergoing on a daily basis, and to try, if we can, sometimes to leave aside some of the cherished academic concepts that we love so much, and try to look at things from a fresh perspective, to speak to the people, and to figure out better ways, intellectual ways, because this is our task one way or another, to relate to them and to converse with each other. I think that we sorely need this sort of conversation that we have now with all the disagreements. We sorely need this sort of dialogue in every possible university, in every possible forums, not to trap ourselves in those echo chambers. And this is why I really appreciate what we have done here, and I do hope that all of us here and elsewhere will be able to just keep on that conversation going.
Thank you very much. Lina?
I will pick up where Uriel left and say, let's see the human suffering and let's stop it. And the first step to do that is push for a ceasefire right now. Let's end the carnage that is happening right now. I think you, the people who are in the US, have the ability to make your voices heard in places that are, I don't know how much it will impact, but I think you have the responsibility to make your voice heard about that. And let's also keep an eye and make pressure about what is going on and the displacement in the West Bank, because I think it is really crucial that we do our best to speak up to end the suffering that is happening now.
Thank you very much to each of you for participating. This kind of dialogue is extremely important. It's essential to making any kind of progress towards peace, justice. I want to thank our audience members for participating. I know you probably felt a lot of anger and frustration and grief and other feelings as you were listening to things and thinking about the current situation. We all appreciate your hanging in there and really trying to understand and learn more here. So we'll close here. And I just want to thank you all again very much for your time and your dedication to these issues.